lots of voices coming forward this morning condemning what Diane Abbott wrote, but also pointing out that she has fought racism for almost the entirety of her career. What are your thoughts on that question?
I think the first thing to say is that the letter is totally indefensible. It's wrong, and it's factually and historically wrong. We can measure the kinds of racist discrimination that the groups that she identified have experienced throughout history and also to the present day. And we don't need every form of racism to be exactly the same for it to be racism. So, for example, I am a South Asian woman. Now, it means that some forms of discrimination which disproportionately impact, for instance, Black people won't affect me in the same way. But that doesn't mean I'm not a victim of other kinds of racism. And you can have that discussion. You can talk about these differences amongst how racism is experienced without saying that one isn't racism, one is merely prejudice. And I think that Diane Abbott, as you mentioned, has been a lifelong campaigner against racism. She's also been somebody who has experienced some of the most vicious and grotesque forms of racism in contemporary politics. And you would hope that somebody like her would know better than to diminish or minimize the experiences of travellers, Irish people and Jewish people.
Do you know what, Ash, actually, when I saw the letter initially, it was really for that reason that I couldn't quite believe that she had put pen to paper, or virtual pen to paper, and written those words. Because we know that Diane Abbott, I think at one point, was receiving more racial hate mail than every MP put together in the House of Commons. It's mind-boggling.
And this is why there has to be an investigation into what happened, because what we would all hope is that this was just some really, tragically clumsy phrasing, and as soon as it went out there and as soon as she saw how her words were being received, that she was filled with regret and embarrassment. And of course people do make mistakes, but there has to be an investigation that gets to the bottom of it. And I think that when it comes to the issue of suspending the whip pending an investigation, that's got to be the rule for everybody. If you've got it for one person, that's got to be the rule for everybody who's being investigated over matters like these in the Labour Party.
Why do you think it's not? You're implying that it's not the rule for everyone.
Well, it has been in some cases. So with the instance of Neil Coyle, for instance, who is accused of racism by a lobby journalist. You also had the instance of Rupa Huck, who had said that Kwasi Kwarteng was only superficially Black. Now, what ended up happening in those two cases was different. Neil Coyle still has had the whip suspended, but Rupa Huck has had the whip returned to her. And she's had the whip returned to her because she's shown real contrition and growth and self-examination. So for me, it's much less a case of going, okay, once somebody's got the whip removed, that's it. It's going, okay, well, if someone's shown that they've grown, is there a way back? And I would hope that there would be for Diane Abbott. She's somebody who I think has made some incredible contributions to politics, and you would hope that she would be willing to learn and to grow and examine herself.
Well, this is what's interesting, though, Ash. So this letter is published. There's quite rightly, and I think you're part of that, outraged voices saying, what on earth were you doing? And then she issues this apology on Twitter. I looked at the timeline and it was about 11 o'clock. Within the hour, she had been suspended. So there's an argument. Is there to be made that having understood that what she had written was downplaying anti-Semitism and was arguably itself anti-Semitic, she then says, gosh, you know what? Unreservedly, I apologise. So why has she been suspended now?
Because those are just the rules of the Labour Party. The thing that I was saying about it has to be the rules for everybody, and where you do see, I think, some real inconsistency with Labour Party rules, for instance, is that you have had people who have been expelled from the Labour Party over anti-Semitism and they've not been allowed back. You've had other people, and I'm giving an example here of Angela Smith, who used to be a Labour MP. She then stood for the independent group. She called people of colour a funny tinge, and she's been allowed back into the membership.
Right.
So for me, the really important thing is that you've got a consistent application of the rules. And if you're saying that there's a way back for Angela Smith, if you're saying there's a way back for Rupa Huck to have the whip returned to her, then Diane Abbott needs to be able to have the same grace allowed to her if she shows that growth and that contrition. But I think, as far as I know, it is just a matter of the rules that there is a suspension pending an investigation. Just that investigation has to be fair, and it has to allow her that same room for growth, that same room for self-examination that others have been granted.
Isn't the real problem here that Jeremy Corbyn completely failed to deal with the anti-Semitism problem, and therefore Keir Starmer feels the need to arguably react in this way incredibly fast, and may, if we take your argument, may not apply the rules in the way in which you would want them applied, because in a way he has to kind of really make it absolutely clear that anti-Semitism is something that will just not be tolerated under any circumstances. And it's almost that kind of backdraft from what happened under Corbyn that might be almost accidentally creating a kind of hierarchy of racism, which is what it seems to me that you're implying.
Well, when it comes to this matter of a hierarchy of racism, racism is racism, and it needs to be stamped. It needs to be stamped out of politics, whether it's anti-Semitism or anti-blackness or Islamophobia.
But aren't you almost suggesting that there's a sort of hierarchy in the way in which it's dealt with, depending on which group is subject to it?
And this is the point that I'm making, is that if what you end up doing is you're saying, okay, well, if it's somebody who's accused of anti-Semitism, they'll be treated in this way and they'll never be allowed back. But if it's somebody who has a history of anti-blackness or Islamophobia, they will be allowed back. While you might be controlling the headlines, what you're ultimately doing is you're pitting communities against each other, and you're really undermining the work which is done against racism in all of its forms. So for me, it's about that consistency. Yes, you might be able to do something which is politically convenient, all right? You get the papers off your back, but you're selling out the very people that you need to be standing up for. So that's why, for me, consistency is the key. And I don't think that Keir Starmer's Labour Party has been consistent in this matter. Martin Ford, the King's Counsel, who was commissioned to write a report into all of these matters, said that there are very real concerns that the Labour Party is operating a hierarchy of racism. Now, as far as I know, and this is something that he's gone public with.
Do you agree with that?
I personally do agree with it, and I can see that from how people I know have been treated, how Diane Abbott has been treated. There was a leaked report which showed her being treated abominably by Labour staff. They have been allowed back into the party membership. Indeed, I think some of them may have even been rehired. So it's about having
are you suggesting
a consistent level field.
Sorry, Ash, are you suggesting, just something really clear, have you just suggested that Diane Abbott has been subject to racism by the Labour Party?
I'm suggesting that Diane Abbott was treated very badly by the Labour Party, and while it wasn't explicitly racist, I do think that a lot of it was motivated by misogynoir, the way in which black women in particular are denigrated and looked down upon. I think that was a motivation. The thing which is undeniable, which we can all agree, as a matter of fact, is that the kind of language that was being used, the kind of hostility, was very cruel, very, very toxic, very bullying. And those are people who have been allowed back into the Labour Party fold. So there has to be consistency in the rules.
Understood.
If other people can learn and grow, then Diane Abbott must be given the same grace. Otherwise, you're saying some forms of racism are more important than others. They're worse than others. They're more serious than others. And that's not right.
Ash, I'm going to have to let you go. Got to get to a break. Ash Sarkar, senior editor of Novara Media, making her feelings very clear, actually, saying that what Diane Abbott wrote was wrong, that she should have been suspended. There should be an investigation. But she says the way in which Labour deals with racism, they are creating a hierarchy of racism in the way in which they deal with different forms of racism, and that is wrong. What do you make of that?